As a writing instructor, I spend many hours of the week reading for my job. I read in class reflections, homework assignments, articles I assign, rough drafts, and, of course, final drafts. I read almost every day because I have to. But I also read almost every day because I want to. I know that reading something I've chosen to read will help me not only relax, but also expand my knowledge and awareness in many different areas. Because I enjoy reading and I know the many benefits I get from reading for pleasure, I have always set aside time to read. But I wondered if my students had the same habits. I teach English 101 in a program that is focused on academic research and writing. While I cover the humanities in my courses, there isn't room in the syllabus for longer works of literature. Most students don't take lit courses their first year, so I was curious to see if my students valued reading for pleasure and if they took time out of their schedules for it. I began my ALP wanting to know what the pleasure reading habits of my English 101 students are like. Some of my pre-ALP research had suggested that students showed interest in faculty-generated supplemental reading lists. I was curious to know if my students would be interested in such a resource as well. As my ALP developed, I started to worry about my students' desire to take on extra work, even if we had talked about the many benefits of reading for pleasure. Thus, I also wanted to know what would motivate my students to choose titles from a supplemental pleasure reading list. I surveyed my 3 English 101 classes and received 54 responses. Out of those 54 students, 43 were freshmen, 6 were sophomores, 4 were juniors, and 1 was a senior. 18 of the students who responded identified as female, and 36 identified as male. To get an idea about their feelings toward reading in general, I asked my students if they liked reading. While 8 students said no, 21 said they did enjoy reading, and another 21 said they sometimes enjoyed reading. 4 students answered with other and wrote in responses like, depends on the topic, or if it is something that I am interested in. I also asked my students if reading is important to them. While I did receive some negative answers, overall I received many positive responses. I then asked my students how many hours per week they thought they spent reading for pleasure during the school year. While the numbers trended towards the lower end of the spectrum, it was heartening to see that most students indicated they would like to read more. Based on my students' responses about their general reading habits, I wanted to know about their previous experiences with instructor-generated supplemental reading lists. I surveyed a subset of the initial group of students and asked them in-depth questions about their experience with reading lists. One of the questions I asked was if any teachers had ever given them a recommended reading list. Out of the 6 students surveyed, 2 had received a supplemental reading list from a teacher, while 4 had not. Of the 2 students who had received lists, 1 had read a selection from the list while the other had not. The ultimate goal of my ALP became building a supplemental pleasure reading list for my students. Therefore, I wanted to know if they would use such a resource and what would motivate them to choose titles from the list. In the survey, I asked the 6 students if they would make an effort to read suggested pleasure reading material outside of class if the resources were connected to concepts or themes from the course. While there were a couple of unenthusiastic responses, most were pretty positive. I also asked my students what might help to motivate them to read selections from a supplemental pleasure reading list. These are their responses. The responses I received from my two surveys seemed to be in line with the results of the studies I'd found about college students and pleasure reading in my pre-ALP research. While I would like to see my students doing more pleasure reading, I was excited to see that so many of them valued reading, that many of them would like to read more often, and that for the most part they would be interested in a faculty-generated supplemental pleasure reading list. The result of my ALP is a supplemental reading list constructed from my students' feedback. I will give this list to two of my spring semester sections of English 101. One section will be required to read 5 selections, blog about their reading, and respond to others. The other section will be given the list and the blog prompts, but will only be encouraged to read the text, not required to. At the beginning of the semester, I plan to administer the same survey about pleasure reading habits that I gave my students this semester for my ALP. Then, at the end of the semester, I will administer another survey to gauge their use and appreciation of the pleasure reading list.